Complete conspiracy, Watson. If you knew the true facts, you'd be amazed at it. In what way? It'll be proven in a few days later what the charges will be filed against me, plus the fact of the assassination. A complete conspiracy against me, Watson.
See, if I'm eliminated, there won't be any way of knowing any bit of the truth pertaining to my situation. And consequently, a whole new form of government is going to take over this country. Yeah. And I know that I won't live to see you some other time. Because I want to tell the truth. And then I want to leave this.
On the night of November 20th, 1963, the small Louisiana town of Eunice had no idea it was about to brush against history. Lieutenant Francis Fruge of the Louisiana State Police was called to the emergency room at Moussa Memorial Hospital. A woman, disheveled, bruised, mumbling incoherently, had been struck by a car outside the Silver Slipper Lounge. Her name was Rose Cheramie. To most, she looked like another lost soul tangled in narcotics and madness. But to Fruge, she was something else entirely. The hospital staff wanted her gone. They believed she was on drugs, maybe hallucinating. With no next of kin, nowhere to take her, Fruge had her booked into the local jail for the night. But within hours, she'd be transferred to the East Louisiana State Hospital, in a straitjacket, still groggy, still muttering something about Dallas, about Cubans, about killing the president. 2 days later, John Kennedy would be dead. Cheramie had made a stunning claim on the ride to the hospital. They're going to kill Kennedy in Dallas. She didn't just blurt it out. She said it like a fact, like a weather forecast. The men she had been traveling with, Cubans or Italians, she wasn't sure, were tied to a narcotics pipeline running from Miami through Texas and into Mexico. But killing Kennedy? Fruge didn't take it seriously until the news broke on November 22nd. And that's where the story fractures into something far more sinister. What began as a freak roadside accident unraveled into a tale of narcotics trafficking, Cuban exiles, and organized crime. Cheramie had been en route from Miami to Dallas, allegedly collecting a heroin shipment in Houston. She spoke of being used as a courier, a pawn in a game that spanned state lines and continents. Her prediction of Kennedy's death, made while in custody, later proved to be more than a coincidence. Fruge documented everything. After Kennedy's death, he escalated the case to his superiors, alerting Colonel Morgan of the state police. The information was passed to U.S. Customs, and soon Fruge, Cheramie, and state agents were flown to Houston in a desperate attempt to intercept the drug shipment she'd described. Customs confirmed much of her story. The hotel reservation, the ship, the names, it all checked out. But the narcotics operation fell apart. The seaman slipped away, the money man vanished, and Cheramie, once again, was left to drift back into the shadows. And that's when things got darker. Cheramie disappeared for a while. Then, in 1965, she turned up dead, struck by another vehicle on a Texas highway, her skull fractured, her body dumped and forgotten. Just like before. He sat in silence. Not just any silence, the kind that hung in the air like a noose. The news had just reached him. President John Kennedy was dead, shot in broad daylight. The man who once led one of the most secretive and feared Mafia empires in American history didn't scream. He didn't speak. He twitched. A faint flicker in his left eye, a subtle shift in his seat, as if some part of him already knew. Or at least suspected. Maybe it wasn't us. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't my son, but the man who took over. Maybe it was the machine we built. A machine that once played kingmaker in the South, which greased the wheels of local politics like it was business as usual, that now had the kind of reach that made presidents sweat. And then came Jack Ruby. Like a ghost from nowhere, stepping forward and silencing Lee Harvey Oswald in front of the world. That's when the silence broke. He knew, not suspected, knew. That method, that execution, it wasn't foreign to him. It was textbook. His family had used it for decades. Set up the fall guy, let the heat settle, then silence the fall guy before he starts singing. Clean, quick, permanent. They used orphans from Sicily for jobs like this. Kids with no last name, no strings, no mothers crying on front steps. Train them to shoot. Give them a storefront, a little cash, a sense of purpose. Then whisper in their ear, "Do you want to keep all this? Earn it. Shoot that man." They'd pull the trigger, and just like that their story would end. A bullet from someone even more trusted, and now back in America, the pattern was repeating. Oswald was the patsy, Ruby was the silencer. But why? Why would Jack Ruby, a guy with a bad temper and a soft spot for his siblings, step into the lion's den, knowing he'd never walk back out? Because he was connected to the New Orleans crew, to the outfit, to the CIA. Jack Ruby wasn't just a hot-headed nightclub owner. He had a rap sheet and a reputation. Brass knuckles in one hand, a blackjack in the other. He pistol-whipped people for fun. He stomped on necks. But he loved his sister Ava and his brother Earl. They were all tied into it. Nightclubs, dry cleaners. Perfect fronts for washing dirty cash. Especially in a city like Dallas, where the New Orleans outfit had fingers in every pie, and the night before the assassination, Ruby had dinner at the Egyptian Lounge with Joe Campisi, the future Dallas boss and underboss to Joseph Civello. Campisi wasn't just serving food, he was serving instructions. The next day, Oswald would die. After Ruby fired the fatal shot and got arrested, the first man to visit him wasn't a lawyer. It was Campisi. He didn't need to say much. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to. Just mentioning the sheriff who helped Civello get a pardon was threat enough. Just standing there was a message. Play ball. Keep your mouth shut. Your family stays safe. That was the unspoken deal. Ruby would take the fall, but the family would protect Eva, Earl, and everything they'd built. But Jack Ruby had other plans. He asked for a transfer, not just out of Dallas, but to Washington. He begged Earl Warren, head of the President's Commission, to move him. "Unless you get me to Washington, you cannot get a fair shake out of me." That was Ruby's moment. That was the tell. He was ready to flip. Warren denied the request. Ruby repeated it again. "Maybe certain people don't want to know the truth that may come out of me." And he was right. They didn't. Warren knew the implications. If Ruby got to Washington, if he opened his mouth in front of the right people, the whole deck of cards could collapse. That wasn't a prison transfer. It was a confession waiting to happen. Instead, Warren met Ruby in Dallas, without the two staff lawyers assigned to investigate him. Leon Hubert and Bert Griffin were frozen out. Griffin, determined to get answers, pushed anyway. He interrogated Sergeant Patrick Dean, the officer in charge of security during Oswald's transfer. Dean lied. Twice. First, about when Ruby supposedly decided to shoot Oswald. Second, about watching Ruby descend the ramp and doing nothing to stop him. Griffin smelled the rot. He told Dean to come back with a lawyer. Dean didn't. He ran straight to Henry Wade, Dallas's district attorney and a close friend of President Lyndon Johnson. Within days, Earl Warren shut Griffin down, shipped him back to Washington, told him he'd never question another Dallas cop again. Then, in a final insult, Sergeant Dean brought to Washington and gave him a public apology. "No member of our staff has a right to tell any witness that he is lying." The message was clear. Truth wasn't welcome here in Ruby. He was left to rot in the sheriff's jail, the very place he feared the most. 3 hours after Oswald's murder, Ruby told FBI agent Ray Hall, "If he had confessed to shooting the president, I probably would never have shot him. Since he hadn't confessed, I was afraid he might be turned loose. But that was a lie, and it revealed more than Ruby intended. How did he know Oswald hadn't confessed? It was still early Sunday morning. No statements had been made public. Unless someone was feeding him inside information, maybe Sergeant Dean, maybe someone higher up. The timeline didn't make sense. Ruby wasn't acting on impulse. He was following instructions, and the lie he told about fearing Oswald would beat the rap was just cover for the real motive, to silence the only man who could talk. Earl Warren could have cracked it all wide open, but he didn't. He let it lie. Jack Ruby had made his offer. One transfer, one fair shake, one truth that might have changed everything. They left him in Dallas, and the truth died with him. When Kennedy fell in Dallas, something cracked in Guy Banister. On November 22nd, 1963, the very day President John Kennedy was assassinated, Banister exploded. He turned on his own associate, Jack Martin, in a rage that was anything but random. The two had fought before, but this was different. The shouting was louder. The fear was real, and this time Banister pistol-whipped Martin so viciously it left him bloody and rambling about names, files, and connections, about Oswald, Ferry, and the Camp Street office they all shared. Banister's world was unraveling. Fast. This was a man who once held power. A former FBI agent, former assistant police chief in New Orleans, and now a private investigator playing both sides of every street in the French Quarter, but still very loyal to Carlos Marcello. But now he was becoming a liability. He walked around in the days following the assassination, muttering praise for Oswald. "You can't judge a book by its cover," he reportedly said. "Who would have thought the kid had the balls to go through with it?" That kind of talk didn't just raise eyebrows, it sent shivers through the underworld. Loose lips like Banister's weren't just dangerous, they were deadly. And as 1964 rolled in, Banister's behavior got worse. Erratic, reckless. He was drinking more, ranting more. And then came the night he really crossed the line. March 31st, 1964. New Orleans. A city bus. Banister, drunk and belligerent, got into a brawl with 3 young men after one of them made a comment about his woman companion. One of them called him darling, and that was all it took. He pulled a gun. On a public bus. A window shattered. The gun went missing. No one was shot, but the damage was done. Guy Banister was arrested for aggravated assault. Once a respected lawman, now a mess of rage, paranoia, and broken glass. The papers ran with it. Former New Orleans officer arrested after gun-waving brawl. A bus driver had to break up the fight. Banister was booked at the 3rd District Station. The streets had turned on him. The cops didn't fear him anymore. His badge didn't mean a damn thing now, and the worst part, Carlos Marcello didn't come. There was no lawyer waiting with a briefcase, no envelope of cash, no favor to call in. Banister had played too close to the flame. He had set up shop next to Lee Harvey Oswald, worked with David Ferrie, tied himself to shadows that were never meant to be seen, and now the heat was too much. By June 1964, New Orleans woke to the news. Guy Banister was dead, found at home. Died unexpectedly, the obituary said. There was no autopsy, no investigation, just silence. His funeral was held quietly at Mulhern Funeral Home. Masonic rites, a few pallbearers, a clean headstone at Riverview Cemetery. They spoke of his years in the FBI, his crusade against corruption in the New Orleans Police Department, his campaign for city council. They said nothing of Camp Street, nothing of Oswald, nothing of the gun on the bus or the beating of Jack Martin. Because by then, everyone understood what had happened. He was no longer useful. He was talking too much, and no one, not Marcello, not the CIA, not the men who really ran New Orleans, was going to let Guy Banister keep talking. He'd known the kid since 1955. Lee Harvey Oswald was just 16 then, skinny, fatherless, angry at the world, and looking for something to believe in. That's when he met David Ferrie, the eccentric pilot with no eyebrows, a loud laugh, and quiet ties to both Carlos Marcello's criminal empire and shadowy government contractors. Ferry didn't just teach Oswald the art of espionage, he taught him how to disappear, how to live a life in the shadows, how to lie with a straight face. Oswald, still a boy, soaked it all in. He was born in New Orleans, the city of masks. His family, already tangled in the local numbers racket, was close to Sam Sawyer's crew, and his uncle, Charles Dutz Murrett, was tied tight. The Murretts were not minor players. They were bookmakers, bagmen, quiet earners for Carlos Marcello's outfit. So when people say Oswald was a nobody, they're either lying or looking the other way. David Ferrie never looked the other way. Even after Oswald defected to Russia, married a Soviet wife, and returned home with a child, Ferrie welcomed him back like a long-lost nephew. Because this wasn't about patriotism. It was about utility and Oswald. He was useful. People had seen them together, not just in New Orleans, but in Jack Ruby's nightclub in Dallas. Dancers, comedians, even a few drunks came forward to say they saw Oswald with Ruby and Ferry, and they weren't exactly hiding it. Ruby introduced them as CIA. And maybe in their own twisted way they were. But truth was messier than that. At that point, both Ferry and Oswald were working for Guy Banister and indirectly for Carlos Marcello. Ferry was the recruiter, the trainer, the manipulator. Oswald was the tool. When Oswald failed to infiltrate pro-Castro groups and couldn't get into Cuba, Ferry offered him a new mission, one that would change the world. The president was coming to Dallas. The motorcade was scheduled to pass directly in front of the Texas School Book Depository. A coincidence? Maybe. But Oswald was already working there. The headlines printed the motorcade route in bold, black ink. Marcello and Ferry read them like a blueprint. They had mocked Dallas as death for Kennedy. And now the window was open. Oswald made his move. He went back to the house he shared with his wife and 2 children and retrieved his rifle. It was November 21st, 1963. That morning, Lee Harvey Oswald took the rifle from the garage of Ruth Payne's home in Irving, Texas. Quietly, deliberately. He had stashed it there in secret, weeks before. That night, he returned to Dallas alone. Lee and Marina Oswald had been living under Ruth Payne's roof in the quiet suburb of Irving. The arrangement had come out of desperation. Their marriage was fracturing. Oswald's moods were growing darker. Ruth, a Quaker and a vocal supporter of civil rights, had opened her home to Marina out of compassion, trying to offer stability to a young woman who barely spoke English and was trapped in a foreign world with an unpredictable husband. Ruth had no idea what was coming. Neither did Marina. Oswald's visit that Thursday night was unannounced. He showed up, stayed the night, then left the next morning with a long, slender package. When asked, he said it was curtain rods. But that was a lie. Inside the package was the rifle, the one that would forever change history. But this wasn't the act of a man planning a lone wolf assassination. If Oswald had truly decided on his own to kill the president, he wouldn't have left his weapon behind. He wouldn't have waited until the night before to retrieve it. He would have had it with him from the moment Kennedy's Dallas visit was confirmed. But he didn't, because he wasn't planning to die. He was planning to get out. Oswald knew he needed an escape, an extraction, and there was only one man he trusted to make that happen. David Ferrie. The eccentric former pilot. The mentor. The handler. Ferrie had the means, access to planes, private airstrips, and quiet connections. And more importantly, he had the muscle behind him, the political favors, the police on payroll, the backing of men like Campisi, Civello, and Carlos Marcello. Oswald believed the machine could protect him, that once the job was done, he'd vanish, flown out of Texas and into the shadows. But it wasn't just about pulling the trigger. There had to be a lookout. The weather needed to hold. If rain struck Dallas and the skies opened up, the Secret Service would slap the bubble top onto the presidential limousine, and the entire operation would fall apart. They needed clear skies. They needed certainty. That's why Oswald was seen by the payphone just minutes before the motorcade turned down Elm Street. He was waiting for the go-ahead. Someone, maybe a lookout, maybe one of Sergeant Dean's men, maybe one of Marcello's men made the call. The signal came through. The sky was clear, the roof was off, the president was exposed. Oswald climbed the stairs. He took position. He aimed, and he fired. Maybe he wasn't alone. Maybe there were others. But Oswald was up there. And once he pulled that trigger, he was never meant to walk away. The real plan had already been drawn. After the hit, friendly faces in the Dallas Police Department, those with connections to the outfit, were supposed to scoop Oswald up quietly. No mugshots, no press. Take him to a private airstrip. Ferry would be waiting. The plane would carry him to Mexico, then on to Cuba. It was supposed to be clean. That's what Ferry believed. Because no matter what else he was, he had known Lee Harvey Oswald since he was a teenager. He wasn't going to set him up for slaughter. At least, not knowingly. Both men believed they had a way out. But plans change. And no one changed a plan like the mob. At the last minute, they turned the tables. There was no extraction, no airstrip, no flight to safety. Oswald had no idea. Ferry stayed behind in New Orleans with Carlos Marcello. And Oswald, he was left holding the rifle. The final patsy in a deadly theater of shadows. The frame-up was perfect. Blame Castro. Light the match. Let the world burn. But something went wrong. The cops didn't show. Oswald was arrested. Ferry never made it to the airstrip. He stayed behind, and in that moment, he must have known. The kid he'd mentored, the boy he'd groomed from a young age, was about to be erased. Just another expendable piece in a deadly game of chess. And that's when Ferry made his move. He slipped out of New Orleans and headed straight for Houston, checking into a roadside motel quietly owned by none other than Carlos Marcello. Panic had set in. He began calling Jack Ruby. The message was clear. You messed up. And if you want to live, if you want to keep your sister and your brother breathing, then you're going to do what's necessary. Jack Ruby had made mistakes before. Big ones. There were whispers that when Carlos Marcello was deported to Guatemala, Ruby had siphoned off a little too much from the skim. The cash he was supposed to be sending up the pipeline to New Orleans. Maybe he thought no one would notice. But Marcello had eyes everywhere. Ruby was one of the most important bagmen in Texas, especially when it came to moving money from Cuba into the hands of the Chicago outfit and the New Orleans syndicate. But Ruby got greedy. And when Marcello returned? He found out everything. He knew Ruby's sister was knee-deep in the racket. He knew his brother was tied in too. And in the world of organized crime, once you're owned by the Mafia, you're owned. Not just metaphorically. You belonged to them. Every breath, every move, every dime. And when they called, you answered. Especially if you loved your family, and Ruby did. So Ruby did what he had to do. He walked into that police station, pulled his revolver, and fired a single shot into Oswald's gut. Right on camera. That same day, Captain Will Fritz, one of the last honest interrogators left in Dallas, sat stunned. He had been working Oswald slowly, building trust. He knew the boy was fragile, but reachable. He believed Oswald might have cracked, not out of fear, but out of rage. Oswald was already saying, "I'm just a patsy." Fritz saw the cracks forming, and then Ruby sealed them shut. The confession died with Oswald. Jean de Mohrenschildt, one of the few people who knew Oswald and his Russian wife Marina personally, once said, "He might not have become involved in the assassination if people had been kinder to him." Fritz echoed that. In his notes, later buried in the Warren Report, he wrote, "I might have gotten a confession if I could have just talked to him alone." But that never happened. The same could be said for David Ferrie. He knew. He knew exactly what had happened. And worse, he knew what he'd done. He had betrayed someone who trusted him with everything. A boy he had taken under his wing back in the 1950s, a lonely boy whose mother did not care too much about what happened to him. A kid desperate for purpose, now reduced to a national disgrace with 2 children left fatherless. Ferry knew Lee Harvey Oswald was deluded, misguided, and tragically alone, and that the last man he ever trusted had turned him into a Louisiana-style patsy. And now that kid was dead. Ferry's conscience wasn't just whispering, it was screaming. The paranoia festered. Any mention of the Kennedy assassination sent him into fits, nervous, sweaty, twitchy. The Warren Report didn't calm him. It made it worse, because the whole thing didn't stack up, not to him, not to anyone who really knew what went down. And Ferry, with his trail of unspoken nights and closed-door conversations, was sure someone would talk. Someone who had been in those bedrooms. So he lied. When the Secret Service came knocking, Ferry told them he never even knew Oswald. He claimed he'd been roller skating in Houston that weekend, that his plane was grounded, that everything was normal. But the lies couldn't hide what the Warren Commission ignored. David Ferrie's name never appeared in the index. Neither did Carlos Marcello. Not once. 888 pages, and not a single mention of the mob boss Robert Kennedy had once deported, interrogated, and labeled the #1 threat to the nation. But the truth? It was right there, in plain sight. Oswald had joined the Civil Air Patrol in 1955. Ferry was his commanding officer. A photograph eventually surfaced. A cookout, Ferry grinning, Oswald lurking in the background, alone, like a ghost. In 1978, the House Select Committee on Assassinations found 5 separate eyewitnesses confirming that Ferry and Oswald not only knew each other, they spent time together. A lot of time. By then, Edward Vobel, Oswald's childhood friend, was already dead. But his interviews, ignored by the Warren Commission, told a different story. One about a lonely kid drawn into a world he barely understood by a man who made him feel seen. Ferry was the recruiter. Marcello was the puppet master. Oswald was the tool, and Jack Ruby, he was the cleaner, the man who made the last problem disappear. It was rushed, it was reckless, and it was pure mob logic. Dallas was never meant to be a symbolic city. It was a death sentence. Carlos Marcello, cold, calculating, and utterly convinced, was one of the first mob bosses to handpick Dallas as the perfect stage for the hit on President John F. Kennedy. He made it sound like scripture when he spoke about it to a trusted associate. You don't cut off the tail of a dog, you cut its throat. No more warnings. No more intimidation. The Kennedys had pushed too far, and this was the response. Santo Trafficante was of the same mind. Sitting in a Miami apartment one night with Cuban exile Jose Aleman, Trafficante tried to talk business, Teamster loans, real estate, Hoffa's headaches. But the conversation turned dark. Trafficante was agitated, furious even. He won't be re-elected, he said of Kennedy. He's going to be hit. Aleman thought he meant political votes, polls, that kind of hit. Trafficante corrected him. He meant it literally. The room went cold. Trafficante had sat in that chair, arms folded, voice low, and flatly predicted the president's murder in Dallas. Aleman didn't interrupt. Macho Jenner was leaving the room. Nobregas looked away. They all knew better than to ask questions when Santo Trafficante spoke in absolutes, and yet it wasn't just idle talk. John Martino, another associate close to both Trafficante and Marcello, told his own son days before the assassination, "If Kennedy ever goes to Dallas, he'll be hit." And he wasn't just making dinner conversation. Martino, in the aftermath, would be the one spreading rumors to reporters, pushing Oswald's supposed links to Castro, to Cuba, to the Soviet embassy. It was misdirection, smokescreen. The game had already started. Kennedy's trip to Dallas had been publicized. Too publicized. The motorcade route was printed in newspapers. It was fate. Pure and brutal fate that tethered the destiny of the Kennedy family to Carlos Marcello. Two powerful bloodlines on a collision course. One born into political royalty, the other carved from the swamps of Louisiana, ruling his kingdom with cash, silence, and fear. And in a strange twist of poetic symmetry, they both married Jacqueline. Carlos Marcello's wife bore the name long before Jackie Kennedy made it iconic. But this wasn't about women. It was about legacy. Two men standing on opposite ends of America's shadow, their stories entangled long before the first shot was fired in Daley Plaza. 4 possible motorcade routes were under discussion. The mob knew them all, and the one that was ultimately selected. That was Sergeant Patrick Dean's contribution. Maybe he was bribed. Maybe he talked too much. But either way, someone got the final route to Oswald. Oswald was seen at a payphone. The weather was clear. The bubble top was off. He got the signal. He climbed to the 6th floor. Then came the shots. Oswald fled. Hours later, staring into television cameras, he declared himself a patsy. He wasn't sweaty. He wasn't wild-eyed. He looked calm, like a man who expected someone to get him out. But once reporters started asking about his Cuban ties, his Russian wife, and his visits to the embassies in Mexico City, he knew. He wasn't getting out. The cleanup began immediately. Marcello, meanwhile, was watching it all unfold like a chess player studying the board. For years, he kept tabs on every article, every report, every whisper. In the 1970s, FBI wiretaps picked up Marcello's conversations with the Campisi crime family. He still read every headline that mentioned Kennedy and the mob. Local papers were intercepted and hand-delivered to him before the national press even got wind. But his fatal flaw wasn't his crime. It was his ego. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't stay quiet. Robert Kennedy didn't let it go either. Even while the Warren Commission marched to its own conclusions, Bobby ran his own silent investigation. He hired private investigator Walter Sheridan to dig deep into Oswald, Ruby and Carlos Marcello, and Sheridan wasn't the only one chasing ghosts. Edgar Hoover opened his own backdoor inquiry. 12 days of interviews, informants, and pressure. Word got back that Oswald had been seen collecting an envelope of cash in New Orleans just days before the assassination. The man who handed it to him, Marcello's own brother. Hoover was stunned. He exploded in fury. He fired every FBI agent in New Orleans. Aaron Cohen, an agent who had been warning about Marcello for a decade, was pulled out of the shadows and made Hoover's personal point man for organized crime in Louisiana. Marcello had expected the heat to cool down after Kennedy's death. It got hotter. Every politician in New Orleans with ties to Marcello came under federal investigation. His safety net was ripped away, and while federal pressure mounted, a quiet storm brewed inside his own crime family. Silver Dollar Sam, Anthony Carolla, returned from Sicily. Some said it was for medical treatment. Others said his own children brought him back to force Marcello out. They'd figured out the truth, or at least suspected it, and if they could figure it out, so could the feds. Carolla had the backing of the Trafficante family. Marcello was cornered. But this was no ordinary boss. He was one of the most sophisticated mob leaders in American history. He still had powerful friends. Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, the Genovese family, the Colombo family. When Lucchese fell ill with a brain tumor, a new boss had to be chosen. A meeting was called. The votes were rigged. But what took place at that meeting would become legend, dubbed Little Appalachian. When Marcello returned to New Orleans, the message was clear. He was still boss. But the noose kept tightening. He punched a federal agent. That led to another indictment, more scrutiny, more trials. He was watching the world close in, and then politics turned against him again. Robert Kennedy was back, not just as a senator. He had his eyes on the White House, and with Martin Luther King Jr. they formed an alliance. The path was clear. Marcello knew the CIA feared Kennedy's return. So did the outfit. He had to move fast. He turned to an old ally, Jim Garrison. Garrison, under federal investigation himself, was summoned. Marcello didn't make polite requests. He gave orders. At the snap of a finger, Garrison reopened the Kennedy case. Quiet at first. Then, in March 1967, it exploded. The newspapers named one man, David Ferrie, and when Carlos Marcello saw that name in print, he knew the storm had finally arrived. It was never really about justice. It was about survival. In early 1967, Jim Garrison, district attorney of Orleans Parish, was facing pressure from every direction. The FBI was sniffing around his office. Whispers were growing about his deepening ties to the underworld, particularly his quiet dependency on one man, Carlos Marcello, the undisputed king of Louisiana's criminal empire. Garrison's home, it turned out, was owned by a captain in Marcello's syndicate, and when Garrison needed a witness, someone who could tie the CIA into a plot to kill the president, it was Marcello who delivered him one, David Ferrie. Ferrie was fragile, bald from illness, erratic from years of paranoia, and crushed by a conscience that had finally begun to crack. He knew Oswald. He had known him since the kid was 16, back when Ferry was a civil air patrol commander, and he had handed Oswald over, fed him into the machine, believing, perhaps naively, that the boy might make it out alive. He was wrong. Now, with the heat turning up and Garrison preparing for a press conference, Ferry was spiraling. The pressure was unbearable. He knew what was coming. He'd seen how Marcello dealt with loose ends. On February 22nd, 1967, David Ferrie was found dead in his apartment. 2 typewritten suicide notes lay beside him. But something was off. His body showed no signs of violence, no overdose, no trauma, just death, clean and efficient. Coroner Dr. Nicholas Chetter called it a cerebral hemorrhage, but in New Orleans, coroners like Chetter had long been accused of being on the take. No one believed it was natural. The night before, Garrison had announced Ferry was going to be indicted in the assassination of President John Kennedy. Then, Ferry dropped dead. Coincidence? Nobody bought it. The whisper started again. Carlos Marcello had silenced him, and Ferry wasn't the only one to go quiet. Within 24 hours of David Ferrie's mysterious death, another body dropped. This time, it was Eladio del Valle, Ferrie's old associate, a former Cuban congressman under Banister, and the self-proclaimed first anti-Castro exile in America. He was found in a red Cadillac parked in a shopping plaza in Miami. His skull was split wide open. A bullet was buried in his heart. A patrolman stumbled across the scene, unsure of what he was looking at, a botched hit, a message. The police were baffled. Officially, they blamed questionable circles and vague ties to pre-Castro Havana. But those who knew Ferry, those who understood the stakes, they knew. Del Valle had been close, too close. He knew about Ferry, about Cuba, about the past and the present, about Oswald. Now he was silent. And it didn't stop there. 3 months later, another of Ferry's confidants, Dr. Mary Sherman, was found murdered in her New Orleans apartment. A renowned cancer specialist, respected around the world, and head of orthopedic surgery at the Oxner Clinic, she was supposed to be above suspicion, above danger. But no one was safe now. Her body was found stabbed 8 times. Her apartment had been set ablaze. Firefighters forced their way inside after neighbors reported smoke. What they found wasn't just shocking, it was surgical. There were no signs of forced entry. Her car was discovered abandoned 9 blocks away. Police theorized she knew her killer, that whoever walked through her door did so with ease, maybe even with a smile. But once inside, they didn't hesitate. Mary Sherman wasn't just Ferry's friend. She was his mirror, his confidant, the one who knew what he had done and what he feared. And like Eladio del Valle, she was now gone. 2 murders, both brutal, both targeted. Both were tied to David Ferrie. The bodies were piling up, and the truth was being buried alongside them. If you included Oswald, that made 3 people with direct ties to Ferry, who were all dead within years of each other. Meanwhile, Garrison pushed forward. He publicly blamed the CIA for Kennedy's murder, drawing a big red circle around Clay Shaw, a respected New Orleans businessman with past ties to the agency. But the real question was, why? Why now? Because Garrison owed Marcello. Marcello had given him campaign support, political favors, even a subsidized house in the suburbs. Garrison returned the favor by turning a blind eye to Marcello's criminal empire, dismissing the idea that organized crime even existed in New Orleans. But now Marcello needed a diversion. The CIA made a perfect villain, and the timing. Impeccable. Robert F. Kennedy was preparing for a run at the presidency, and this investigation, this circus, served as a warning shot. If Bobby came after Marcello again, they would smear him with his brother's blood. The message couldn't have been clearer. The FBI was watching Hoover's files exploded with movement. He scrambled agents, issued directives, and tried, unsuccessfully, to discredit Garrison. But the genie was already out of the bottle. Allegations flooded in. One FBI informant spoke about Marcello and of his ties to Jack Ruby through another link, which involved the Bourbon Street clubs, and a stripper named Jada, who had danced both at Pete Marcello's show bar and Ruby's Carousel Club in Dallas. Meanwhile, Edward Becker, a New Orleans businessman, fingered Marcello directly. He told FBI agents that Marcello had ranted about Kennedy's war on the Mafia, screaming in a fit of rage, "Get rid of that little son of a bitch." Yet, even Becker's account was suppressed. Hoover tried to get his testimony pulled from a book. I tried to erase it. Too late. By the summer of 1967, Hoover's dam was cracking. The media was finally waking up. Books were flying off the shelves. Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, Josiah Thompson's 6 Seconds in Dallas, Sylvia Meagher's Accessories After the Fact. For the first time, the American public wasn't buying the lone nut narrative. They were asking questions, and some of the answers led back to Carlos Marcello. But Jim Garrison? He kept the spotlight away from the Mafia. He zeroed in on the CIA, pushed Clay Shaw to trial, and kept the media circus spinning. Privately, Garrison may have believed what he was saying. Publicly, he was a pawn, a tool, and Marcello. He wasn't done playing. In June 1967, a campaign was launched to destroy Edward Partin, the key witness who had helped put Jimmy Hoffa in prison. Hoffa's allies, including Marcello and his fixer D'Alton Smith, offered Partin $1 million to recant. He refused. So they did the next best thing. They used Garrison's investigation to paint Partin as part of the Kennedy plot. Radio stations in Baton Rouge picked up the story. Garrison, willingly or not, had become an accomplice in a campaign to discredit the one man who could keep Hoffa behind bars. Hoover had seen a lot in his long reign atop the bureau, But nothing prepared him for the storm Jim Garrison was brewing in New Orleans. Hoover wasn't just surprised. He was stunned. For the first time, he saw the full scale of Carlos Marcello's empire, how deep it ran, how far it stretched, and just how insulated it was. The secrets Marcello held could crack open Washington like a melon, and Hoover, for once, realized the Bureau was outmatched. For years, Hoover treated New Orleans like a punishment post. Agents who embarrassed him or questioned his authority were quietly reassigned to Louisiana, a place he believed would break their spirits, with its unbearable heat, sweltering humidity, and political chaos. But Hoover had underestimated the Crescent City. Its jazz clubs, vibrant street life, the cuisine, and easy charm did the opposite. These agents fell in love with New Orleans, and worse, they started to get comfortable with their underworld. By the time the 1960s rolled around, Hoover's Southern problem had become an embarrassment. His own agents, men handpicked to fade into bureaucratic obscurity, were now wining and dining with Marcello's lieutenants. Some were building social capital by cozying up to Marcello himself, and Hoover, who had spent decades denying the existence of organized crime altogether, had walked himself into a trap. These were the same men he would later tell, "Back off, Marcello. We're not here to prod, we're here to gather." Carlos Marcello wasn't just a crime boss, he was a kingmaker. He had political allies across the South, powerful lawyers in D.C., and a velvet rope into the back rooms of power. Even men in Hoover's orbit, like Washington fixer Irving Davidson and attorney Jack Wasserman, were known to share a drink with the very crime figures Hoover had just realized were a threat. After the Kennedy assassination, Hoover attempted a quiet course correction. He initiated an internal shakeup of the FBI's New Orleans office. He promoted Aaron Cohn, a longtime investigator who had been warning about Marcello for years and was largely ignored, to become his personal liaison on New Orleans criminal affairs. But the move was too little, too late. What Marcello was running down there wasn't just a racket. It was a government of its own, and the backlash came fast. Some of the Bureau's own men, furious at Hoover's inaction and loyal to the legacy of Robert Kennedy, left the FBI entirely. They went straight into the arms of sympathetic publications, outlets like Life magazine, which still carried a torch for the fallen Kennedy brothers. These men brought evidence, stories, and raw disgust, and what followed was open warfare in print. In September 1967, Life magazine launched a blistering exposé. They ran pieces on the Las Vegas Skim, on Edward Partin, and on Carlos Marcello's grip over Louisiana politics. They revealed that Marcello had been entrusted with $2 million to help get Jimmy Hoffa out of prison. And in the middle of it all, they mentioned Jim Garrison, who was still insisting publicly that organized crime did not exist in New Orleans. 1 week later, Life followed up with a surgical strike. The September 8th issue dismantled Garrison's credibility, exposing his political ties to Marcello's associates and shining a spotlight on the district attorney's questionable alliances. Garrison was humiliated, and the war was no longer hidden. Marcello responded the only way he knew how, with pressure. He sent his lawyers and political enforcers straight to the offices of Life magazine, threatening lawsuits and demanding retractions. But the magazine didn't blink. They had more. Much more. Photographs, documents, testimony. Life had a kill shot's worth of dirt on Carlos Marcello, his criminal syndicate, and the rotting foundation of Louisiana's political structure, and even after the storm of March 1967, after Life magazine cracked him open and exposed his ties like a gutted fish, Jim Garrison refused to quit. His investigations didn't stall, they escalated. It became a personal crusade. He wasn't just chasing shadows, he was trying to embarrass Hoover, to humiliate the man who had built his career denying the Mafia even existed. And the truth was, it wasn't hard. Garrison's own financial dealings hinted at something murky. On a public salary of $17,500 a year, he managed to purchase a handsome upper-middle-class home at 4600 Owens Boulevard. The property had been built by Frank Occhipinti, a man with well-documented business ties to Carlos Marcello, the undisputed boss of the New Orleans Mafia. Occhipinti, along with Peter Cassano, the seller of the home and also connected to the Occhipinti law firm, was enmeshed in real estate ventures and development deals with the Marcello family. Marcello and his brothers, together with the Occhipintis, had long been involved in lucrative enterprises, including the Town and Country Motel along the airline highway, a property that, even after it was sold, remained under their control. As of 1968, Carlos Marcello's name still appeared in the Jefferson Parish tax records for the motel, a known headquarters for other Mafia-connected ventures like Southern Tours Incorporated, which operated sightseeing buses in partnership with Marcello's brother Anthony and Basil Ingracia. Despite this evidence, Garrison publicly referred to Carlos Marcello as a respectable businessman during a taped NBC interview. Law enforcement officers familiar with Marcello's operations reportedly laughed out loud at the statement. This was a man, after all, whom the Immigration and Naturalization Service had been attempting to deport for years. Even more damning, Garrison had once accepted hospitality indirectly from the mob boss. His expenses during a Las Vegas trip in 1967 were covered by Mario Marino, a former Marcello flunky and known button man. Marino, when summoned for questioning by investigators, was picked up at the airport by Marcello's brother Joseph and whisked away to Marcello's estate in Covington, Louisiana. The FBI, tailing the group, documented the entire rendezvous. Then there was David Ferrie, one of Garrison's original suspects in the alleged JFK conspiracy. Ferry was more than just a bizarre and volatile presence. He had long-standing ties to Marcello. He had worked as an investigator for Ray Gill, Marcello's personal attorney, and had been in regular contact with Marcello. There were even whispers that Ferry had piloted the plane that brought Marcello back from Guatemala following a forced deportation. Yet Garrison, armed with subpoenas, a national platform, and the full resources of a district attorney's office, chose not to investigate the one man with the motive, means, and muscle to orchestrate a hit on President John Kennedy. Carlos Marcello, whose empire stretched from the French Quarter to the corridors of political power, was virtually untouched. Instead, Garrison focused on Clay Shaw, a respected businessman and private citizen with no ties to organized crime. Garrison's case against Shaw, concocted on the flimsiest of premises and bolstered by hypnotized witnesses and fabricated stories, ultimately collapsed. Still, Garrison pressed forward, charging Shaw with perjury in a desperate bid to sustain the illusion of legitimacy. It wasn't just delusion. There were whispers of vendettas and financial motives. Garrison maintained a secret fund, JGSAFI, or Jim Garrison's Special Aid for Investigation, which he used as he saw fit, sometimes mixing private and personal expenses. Former aides, like Tom Bethel and William Gurvich, quit in disgust and were later indicted or charged for supposed theft of office records, a tactic that reeked more of retaliation than justice. The Internal Revenue Service eventually took notice. 2 special agents were sent to New Orleans to investigate Garrison's finances and associations. There was a pretty strong smell, one former IRS official remarked, referring to Garrison's close proximity to men who can operate only if they know the right people. The investigation was active and ongoing at the time the source left the agency. Garrison, naturally, claimed it was all part of a federal vendetta. But the most damning fact of all remained this. Garrison, the self-styled slayer of conspiracies, had every reason and every opportunity to look into the Mafia's potential involvement in President Kennedy's assassination. Particularly the involvement of Carlos Marcello, who had a direct motive in Attorney General Robert Kennedy's aggressive anti-racketeering campaign. Instead, Garrison looked the other way. He aimed his fire at the dead, the marginalized, and the politically expendable. In doing so, he protected the powerful, whether by design or convenience, and became, in the eyes of many, not the man who exposed the truth, but the man who helped bury it. There were boxes of files, whispers in strip clubs, old court records, and loose-lipped men with long memories. Strippers spoke of Oswald. Dancers recalled Ruby. Comedians, waitresses, even low-level hoods all talked about David Ferrie and the quiet little introductions he made, like the time he brought Oswald into Ruby's club and told everyone they were both CIA. Garrison knew Ferry had once stood in court with Carlos Marcello, shoulder to shoulder with Guy Banister. There were photographs, witnesses, court records, trails, and every trail he followed took him back to the same names: Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, Hoffa. But the deeper Garrison went, the more he was being played. Used. He became a pawn in a far bigger game, a walking diversion. Hoffa's people were feeding him breadcrumbs. Marcello's men were helping him stir the pot. Each tip pushed him closer to the CIA and further away from the mob. That was the plan. Distract, deflect, delay, and Garrison delivered perfectly. By the time Clay Shaw was acquitted, Garrison's reputation had been obliterated. His courtroom had turned into a circus. He paraded theories so bizarre they collapsed under their own weight. One of them: that President Kennedy was killed as part of a gay conspiracy involving Clay Shaw, David Ferrie, and Jack Ruby. Because Kennedy, in Garrison's mind, was just too handsome for them to resist. It sounded insane. It was insane. But it was also on record. I've already covered that absurd theory in one of my earlier documentaries, using direct press quotes, word for word as they came out. Because history isn't always clean. Sometimes it's chaotic. And sometimes the only way to find the truth is to dig through the debris, article by article, statement by statement, until the voices from the past speak louder than the spin. By 1969, it was over. In March of that year, Clay Shaw walked free. The jury took less than an hour, 55 minutes, to reach a decision. One of Shaw's first interviews afterward was with a journalist from Look magazine, someone he trusted. He didn't gloat. He didn't shout. He just told his side of the story. Garrison's case? In ruins. But even in disgrace, Jim Garrison had served a purpose. He didn't crack the case. He clouded it. He muddied the waters. He brought Carlos Marcello the one thing every gangster prays for: time. It would take another 11 years, until the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the case, for organized crime to be officially named as a likely conspirator in the Kennedy assassination. But by then, the game had changed. Witnesses were dead. Records were gone. The trail had been doused in gasoline and set on fire. Jim Garrison wanted to make history. Instead, he bought it, and the cost was truth. By 1969, Carlos Marcello was untouchable. He stood in the shadows of Louisiana's swamps and smiled, because he knew something that Washington didn't. While Garrison was chasing ghosts, Marcello had gone to war again. The year was 1968, and the boss was sharpening his blade. His world was shifting right before his eyes. The old control was slipping. Carlos Marcello, once the undisputed king of Southern corruption, was watching the very machine he built begin to break down. He had lived off buying elections, controlling unions, fixing judges, and stacking the vote. But in 1968, everything began to tilt. Martin Luther King Jr. was organizing the black vote with terrifying efficiency across the South. The civil rights movement had awakened not just New York, Chicago, and California, but Mississippi, Arkansas, and Marcello's own backyard of Louisiana. The old Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats who built their kingdoms on segregation and suppression, could feel their grip slipping. And the death of John Kennedy had only accelerated the change. So, they turned to an old playbook, one written in the British Empire's colonial blood: divide and conquer. It didn't matter if it was race, religion, education, or geography. Southern elites and crooked politicians across the country, from Chicago to California, saw what was coming, and they panicked. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, segregationists in tailored suits. Their answer wasn't unity, it was manipulation. They weaponized division to maintain power. They teamed up with gangsters, spooks, and corporate barons. They turned the American dream into a battlefield, using propaganda perfected by the Nazis and stolen through Operation Paperclip. The CIA took notes. They took scientists, and they took control. Universities stopped being centers of thought and became factories for war. Scientific breakthroughs, medical advancements, even space travel, none of it benefited the people footing the bill. American taxpayers were financing their own oppression, feeding a political class more powerful than any monarchy, and building a military-industrial complex that didn't just dominate global warfare, it dominated the soul of the nation, and standing against all of it were two men, Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. If Bobby Kennedy got back into the White House, Marcello knew it was over. This wasn't the naive young brother from 1961 anymore. This was a man who had picked Marcello up from New Orleans and dumped him in Guatemala. If he came back to power, he'd finish the job. Marcello had thought the bullet that killed John Kennedy would end it. Cut the head off, and the body dies. But Bobby Kennedy was a ghost that wouldn't leave. A relentless hunter, the tail that wouldn't stop twitching. Now Bobby had to go too. In 1968, they did it again. First, they took out Martin Luther King Jr., the man who dared to unify the poor, black and white. Then, weeks later, they shot Robert Kennedy dead in a Los Angeles kitchen pantry. Two voices silenced. Two threats were neutralized. The 1960s became a decade of assassinations, not just of men, but of ideas. Anyone who stood in the way of secrecy, of corruption, of the shadow state, was eliminated. Hoover had always claimed communism was the enemy, but after the Kennedys, he changed his tune. He told his men to forget the Reds. Now they were going after organized crime. Too little, too late. Because the CIA had never served the people. Since the days of the OSS, they had made their alliances not with Congress or the Constitution, but with the underworld. In Italy, naval intelligence officers worked hand in glove with the Genovese family to smuggle heroin under the pretense of fighting the Soviets. The same dope that poured through France and into Harlem came in through Louisiana. That trafficking network was an intelligence operation, one that continued even after Vito Genovese went to prison. These men weren't just running drugs. They were funding black operations, controlling elections, and infiltrating governments. The IRS never tried to take over the White House. Neither did the FBI, but the CIA. They had been trying to install one of their own since the days of Tom Dewey, and they finally did it through Truman and later Nixon. It was under Eisenhower and Allen Dulles that the CIA reached its golden age. But all of it, everything they built, came crashing down under John Kennedy. That's why I started this channel. To tell the stories no one else would. To shine a light not just on the Mafia as we know it, but on the Southern underworld. On the Marcello machine. On the history they buried. This isn't just a story about New Orleans or Dallas. It's a story about America. About power. About truth. And about the ghosts that never stopped haunting the men who thought they could get away with murder. I'll end this chapter here. But the story continues. Because when I begin the documentary on Carlos Marcello, we're going all the way.